He pointed out
Good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Ranch in Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Oceanic. Today I'm going to start with the middle ground and working this
in simple words,
plasma patterning into the landscape and then radiating around the sun with the yellow, blending back into white, then violet, as it radiates outward from her aura.
Reserved to the United States. It can delegate that right to some of its clients, but no one else should line up for the privilege. That's clear and explicit. The national security doctrine was immediately followed by exemplary actions to make it clear to the world that it was meant seriously. It's not just rhetoric. The most obvious of them, and the one that attracted the most attention, was the invasion of Iraq. There were others that were, to which less attention was paid, but that might, over the long term, prove more significant. One of them was the announcement, just weeks after the national security doctrine, the announcement by the Air Force Space Command that U.S. policy in accord with the national security doctrine was going to shift from control of space, that was the Clinton doctrine, to ownership of space. So from now on, the U.S. would own space, not just control it. And then they went to spell out what that difference is. It means that any potential competitor in space will be destroyed. And space means militarization of space, as they explain. We have documents leading up to it spelling it out. It means placing space platforms for highly destructive offensive weapons, nuclear and non-nuclear. This is under a first strike doctrine, which is official. The world will be under very tight surveillance by hypersonic drones, so you can tell if somebody's walking across the street in Bangkok and so on. And it means, in principle, a command post could instantaneously, without warning, attack and destroy any place in the world without much need for forward basing and other annoyances. And this system has to be owned, not just controlled. That was November 2002. The U.S. continued, meanwhile, to oppose unilaterally UN efforts to ban the militarization of space. This has been going on for some years. The most recent case was last December, when, again, unilaterally, with the reflexive votes of Israel and I think Micronesia, the U.S. opposed the otherwise unanimous decision to reserve space for peaceful uses. This has been going on for some years now. UN disarmament commissions have been deadlocked over Washington's refusal, back to Clinton, to ban militarization of space. However, the advance from control to ownership is a substantial one and in line with the national security doctrine, and very ominous in its implications. I mean, others plainly don't just say, oh, that's fine. Russia has already responded by sharply increasing its military spending, its offensive weaponry. It has moved to launch on warning automated response systems, which were dangerous enough in the past and are far more dangerous today with the deteriorating command and control systems of the Russian state as the economy collapses. Just to cheer you up, you may recall in 1995, before the deterioration had set in, we came at 2 minutes from a missile launch, which probably would have destroyed much of the world. When there was a 10-minute countdown after Russian computers had misidentified a space rocket as a missile attack, it was aborted 2 minutes short of flight. Instant retaliation, presumably go beyond what Eisenhower predicted in the 1950s, that any such exchange would mean the destruction of the Northern Hemisphere. We've gotten much more violent and powerful since then. These dangers are being enhanced. Russia has also moved to a first strike doctrine. China is responding the same way as predicted. What's called ballistic missile defense is understood both by adversaries and by advocates in the United States as being an offensive weapon. It's called a shield, a sword, not just a shield, on both sides. And the reaction to it is to build up offensive military forces, very threatening with the obvious ripple effects. Don't have to go into it. So these are all severe challenges, threats being significantly escalated, all implementing the same thinking. Can't just attribute it to the Bush administration, mentioned as roots before, but the sharp escalation of it is significant, very significant. The moonshot, the Chinese and American moonshots are very likely related to this. The moon is, if any of this gets off the ground, to use an appropriate metaphor, probably the moon will be used for military purposes as part of the militarization of space system. And the Chinese challenge to land a shuttle is a challenge to the U.S. official position of ownership of space, which does not lead to attractive consequences if you think it through. Well, let's get back to Kissinger and the justification for the revolutionary new doctrine and its implementation in Iraq. He gave the conventional justification. The justification is that Iraq possesses weapons of mass destruction and is connected to terror. Well, it's by now clear, even from the scandalous Hutton report, that Bush and Blair and their associates sexed up the intelligence reports, borrow the notorious BBC phrase, which elicited interesting hermeneutic disquisition from Lord Hutton, as you may have seen if you put yourself through the pain of reading the report. But that the intelligence data was sexed up is not seriously in question. And the purpose was to establish that Iraq was a dangerous, imminent threat because of its weapons of mass destruction and its ties to terror. Recall that that was presented as the only question, repeatedly, the only question by Colin Powell, Jack Straw, and others. And it's rather clear that they had to know at that time that any evidence they had was shaky at best. Now, we know how shaky, but what is important is what they knew then. Well, the failure to find weapons of mass destruction has been significant, but I think its major significance has been somewhat overlooked. The main significance of the failure to find weapons of mass destruction is that the bars for aggression have been lowered. So the original doctrine was what Kissinger and the National Security Strategy stated. State countries that have weapons of mass destruction are too dangerous if they're rogue states or whatever. Well, now you have to change the doctrine, and it has been changed. So it is now just the possession or the intent or ability to produce weapons of mass destruction is sufficient to justify aggression, the supreme crime of Nuremberg. That's a significant change, because almost everyone has the ability. The high school in your local community probably has the ability to produce chemical and biological weapons, and the intent is just subjective evaluation, which means that anyone is subject to attack. That's been made even more clear just a few days ago by Condoleezza Rice, who reviewed what are now the official reasons that justify the attack against Iraq, and it's worth looking at them, not as a criticism of her, but to see what the conditions are that are now accepted for free aggression. According to her, the attack on Iraq was legitimate because it had used weapons of mass destruction in the past. She omitted conventionally the words "with our support." Those are never added. Secondly, it had attacked neighbors twice, again omitting the fact that the first attack was with our support, and the second attack was followed by U.S. authorization to Saddam Hussein to crush a Shiite rebellion, which might well have overthrown him, a fact which has an eerie similarity to what's happening right at this moment, as the U.S. the CPA is desperately evading the call of Iraqis for an election in which the Shiite majority would obviously dominate. So that's the second reason. The third reason is that Saddam Hussein allowed terrorists to run in his country and was funding terrorists outside of his country. Well, she didn't bother providing evidence for that. We do have evidence, namely, that it was false, but that now something like that is true. So the evidence that we have, and intelligence agencies and independent analysts pretty much agree on this, is that before the U.S. invasion, Iraq had kept quite far from the international terrorist organizations. But after the invasion, predictably, Iraq itself has become a terrorist state, another front in the so-called war on terrorism, and that recruitment for al-Qaeda-style groups has significantly increased. So as predicted, the war did increase the threat of terror, and indeed succeeded for the first time in turning Iraq into a nest of terror. Her fourth argument is that Iraq has refused to account for its weapons of mass destruction, and Saddam concealed his programs. Well, that's partially true. Actually, Iraq was more closely investigated by inspectors than other countries which have anything like comparable programs. But that aside, there is another country in the region which has refused to account for its weapons of mass destruction and concealed its programs, even though it's well known that it has hundreds of nuclear weapons and is producing chemical and biological weapons, and is regarded as extremely hazardous, in fact, by the U.S. Military Command, Strategic Command, STRATCOM, but that one doesn't count because that's a U.S. client, so it's therefore free of any of these obligations. Another U.S. ally, as has recently been made public, though it was known for a long time, Pakistan has been openly involved in illegal proliferation for years. It's all been quite public. Inconceivable that U.S. intelligence agencies didn't know. The worst of what's now being exposed was in the late 80s and the early 90s, and it's hard to imagine that the National Security Advisor at the time, or the head of the Pentagon, didn't know what was publicly available on the streets of Islamabad, meaning that the current Secretary of State and Vice President had to know about this right at the time. There's now a fuss being made properly because it is indeed extremely dangerous. Well, those are the four reasons for attacking Iraq. Run through them. They, in effect, eliminate any barriers to the use of force at will. Almost no pretense left. Well, let me drop that and turn to the corollary. The idea that states that harbor terrorists must be attacked to eradicate evil. Here we have to make an exception. We have to agree to exclude the category of harboring government officials. If we open that door, the doctrine instantly reduces to absurdity. So let's not talk about harboring government officials who are large-scale terrorists, and keep to harboring what are called subnational terrorists, those who aren't at the level of state planners or heads of state. So what about which countries harbor subnational terrorists? Well, there are many charges about pre-invasion Iraq, the kind that I've mentioned that you've heard, but they're rather dubious, and it isn't there's much point paying much attention to them because there are some very clear cases of harboring terrorists, therefore terrorist states, where this is not controversy. So take, for example, a case that's currently timely, the case of the Cuban Five, which ought to be front page news everywhere. Their appeal is coming up in about 2 weeks. What are the Cuban Five? Well, as I'm sure you know, the United States has been engaged in large-scale terrorist attacks against Cuba since 1959. The U.S. government direct participation in those attacks ended in the late 70s, at least officially. But since that time, instead of directly attacking Cuba, the United States has been harboring terrorist networks that attack Cuba. Well, again, this is not particularly controversial. It's accepted, for example, by the FBI and the Justice Department. So take, say, Orlando Bosch, who's now living happily in Florida. He is accused by the FBI of about 30 acts of terrorism, quite serious ones, like blowing up a Cubana airliner with killing 73 people and many others, some committed on U.S. soil. The Justice Department, U.S. Justice Department, regards him as a dangerous terrorist whose presence in the United States is a serious threat to the United States, and says that for 30 years he has been engaged in implementing or organizing terrorist activities. George Bush I gave him a presidential pardon at the request of his son, the governor of Florida, so that major terrorist is now carefully harbored in Florida. What about the Cuban Five? Where do they fit into this? In the early 90s, when it was clear that terrorist attacks were going to go on from there, Cuban agents infiltrated Florida terrorist groups for several years. At one point, the Cuban government informed the FBI that they now had large-scale information about terrorist groups operating in the United States. The FBI sent high-level officials to Havana, where they were given thousands of pages of documentation and hundreds of hours of video and audio tape documenting terrorist actions being planned and some carried out in Florida. And the FBI did react, namely by immediately arresting the people who gave them the information. That's the Cuban Five. They reacted by leaving the terrorist cells untouched and not pursuing the information, but arresting the informants who had infiltrated them and provided them with the information. 3 are now facing life sentences. Several spent a long time in Sminoff, whatever that is, in solitary confinement. Their wives are not allowed to visit them, no visas. The government insisted on trying the case in Miami. The request for a change of venue was turned down. The foreman of the jury opened by saying that I regard Castro as a communist dictator, and other members of the jury went on. The prosecution conceded that they couldn't prove the case, but a Miami trial was sufficient. So that's the case of the Cuban Five, now coming up for appeal. Why is Cuba such a target for U.S. terror? Well, actually, that was explained nicely yesterday in the lead story of the Wall Street Journal. Take a look at the lead story. You see it described. It says that Cuba has been dedicated to the cause of derailing the U.S. agenda in Latin America, and therefore is a justified target for attack. Actually, the author of the story probably didn't know it, but he was virtually quoting from declassified CIA documents 40 years earlier, which explained the reason for the attack, at that time, extensive terrorist attack on Cuba, on the grounds that Cuba, that the very existence of the Castro regime is successful defiance of U.S. policies going back 150 years. And so it just can't be meaning back to the days of the Monroe Doctrine, when the U.S. intended to take over Cuba. So no Russians, nothing like that. So obviously that can't be accepted, and the Wall Street Journal more or less has it straight when they say that the crime is the dedication to the cause of derailing the U.S.'s agenda in Latin America. The same article of the Wall Street Journal goes on to say that Chavez in Venezuela is the heir apparent to Castro's cause of derailing the U.S. agenda in Latin America, which makes Venezuela, the successful existence of that government, an unacceptable successful defiance of U.S. policies going back 150 years, with consequences that will be familiar to people who know about the history of this region. And again, it's timely. Just a few days ago, Venezuela sought extradition of two military officers who had fled Venezuela after they were charged with setting off bombs in Caracas. They're now here. Venezuela's asking for extradition. Two more terrorists harbored here for the moment. We'll see what happens with that. This is connected with the military coup a couple months ago, which was openly backed by the Bush administration, although it drew back when it aroused an enormous opposition in Latin America, and the military coup was overthrown. According to the British press, very good correspondents in the British press, Latin American specialists, they claim to have amassed evidence that the coup was instigated, or at least in part instigated, by three major figures of the Bush administration who have a long record of involvement in terrorist crimes in the 1980s, namely Elliot Abrams, Otto Reich, and John Negroponte. Their involvement in terrorist crimes in the 1980s, again, isn't controversial. For that, we can turn to the World Court judgment that Tony mentioned, and two Security Council resolutions endorsing the World Court judgment, which of course were vetoed by the United States, with Britain politely abstaining. Just to draw some conclusions, the Bush doctrine quite directly implies that the United States is a terrorist state and should be treated accordingly. It's obviously harboring terrorists. I gave a few examples, can easily add many others. Just add one more. Right across the river, there's a leading terrorist being harbored, Emmanuel Constant, who was the head of the paramilitary organization that was responsible for killing thousands of Haitians in the period of the military junta, which was supported not so tacitly by Bush 1 and even more by Clinton. Haiti has asked for his, they've sentenced him in absentia, they've asked for his extradition repeatedly, they never get a response. The general suspicion is that the U.S. doesn't want to extradite him because in a trial, his connections with the U.S. intelligence will come out. But whatever the reasons are, he's another terrorist harbored here. One might say that killing several thousand poor black people doesn't really count as much of a crime. So maybe it's not like other cases of harboring terrorists. Won't go into that. Well, without continuing, it's not very hard to evaluate the doctrine of driving evil from the world if we accept the condition of universality, but as Henry Kissinger accurately pointed out, that's an error. The doctrine holds only selective. It's a doctrine that the powerful may invoke, but not anyone else. So therefore you could say that all the examples I've given are completely irrelevant and any others like them. As for the imperial grand strategy, I think its implications are as revolutionary as Henry Kissinger indicated. I think a good case can be made that the implications go far beyond, and that it should be a matter of
detach the
rather considerable concern.
No, thank you very much. I hope we have time for a few quick questions.
All right, I didn't have that zoomed in. I should have, but I guess that's okay for the final project anyway. We'll have a handout view for a minute. But that's
present you with
sort of the plasma, watery texture of energy network emanating from her and then back into the landscape and into the star or the sun. So I'll just keep up with that patterning like that and work it around to the left side and then down into this water on the bottom, and then do some more detailing on her figure, and after that it should be pretty close. So that one's getting closer. But that's it for the moment. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom at Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Oceanic. Thanks for watching and have a good evening, Earth.